next up, we have Joan Garry. So I gotta tell you, sometimes you meet somebody and right off the bat, like instantly you go like, oh, like this person's the real deal, right? Like that exactly was my thought. That was my reaction when I first met Joan. Like I just thought like, oh, she's the real deal, right? So she was part of the team that launched MTV, right? Come on, forget about it, right? She was an executive Showtime. And then as she says, she was either in a midlife crisis or avoiding one when she became the executive director of GLAAD, one of the largest gay rights organizations in the US, and navigated it through perhaps its most important decade, or at least as it was helping to redefine what it meant to be gay in America. She's an elite executive coach for CEOs at some of the nation's most impactful organizations. And her blog, podcast, and her book, check it out, joangarry.com, 2 R's, has become almost like a Dear Abby of the not-for-profit sector. She is laser focused these days on developing and supporting both leaders and leadership, right, in some of the most important not-for-profit sectors that exist. And I'm particularly impressed, and I think you will be too, with her ability to integrate joy into mission-driven, passionate endeavors, right? She'll help us hopefully connect the dots today, right? Between our thinking, right, this cognitive side of strategy, and this passion, our heart, right, as well as the realities of how things have actually gotten done on the social challenges that have preceded us, right? So please welcome Joan Garry. Joan, take it away.
Hey, David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I wanted to just begin by saying that I was really grateful for the opportunity to join you this afternoon. I wanted to thank Jim Carroll Jim Carroll's an old friend, and he came a knocking and said, wouldn't you like to do this? And he kind of had me at hello. Your work matters to me quite personally, and I'm going to share a little bit about that a little bit later on. Nat spent some time, and David as well, talking about narrative and framing. And that last quote, inherent in Nat's last quote, is yes, you can change the story. And that's what actually my story is about today. And the thing I want you to really remember is that you have the power to change the story, the narrative about diabetes. You can change hearts and minds. And in fact, actually, it's the only path forward. It's the key to ending discrimination, to making real and lasting change. It's the key to advocacy. And I know what I'm talking about here because I am a member of the LGBT community, and I was a national LGBT leader. And I have been an integral part of this journey to change hearts and minds about LGBT people. And so in the spirit of this notion of changing the narrative and storytelling, my talk today is in fact a story. I'm going to take you on a journey. And assuming I can actually get my slides going, we're going to do just that. All right. So my story begins in 1968. This was the first documentary about gays and lesbians. For gay people who saw this, they will never forget it. It was deeply defamatory and chilling. I might put a link to the YouTube video in the chat or at some place so that you can really get a grip of it. But I want to quote from the open of this CBS report. Remember, 1968. Mike Wallace was the host, and he has subsequently apologized endlessly for this documentary. And he says this: homosexuality is an enigma. Even in this era of bold social mores, it remains a subject people find disturbing, embarrassing, a real reluctance to even broach the subject. And yet there is a growing concern about homosexuals in society and their increasing visibility. In preparing for this broadcast, CBS News commissioned a study with the Opinion Research Corporation into attitudes towards homosexuality, and we discovered that Americans find homosexuality to be more harmful than adultery, abortion, and prostitution. That's where we were in 1968. The next year, 1969, Stonewall Inn, the West Village, a peaceful evening for gay men enjoying themselves in a club, a police raid. It was the beginning of the marker of the modern gay rights movement. But what I want you to look at is the headline. Headlines tell stories. Homo nest raided queen bees are stinging mad. Trust me when I say this was one of the tame ones. We then move on to 1973. 1973. The American Psychiatric Association declares that homosexuality is no longer a mental illness. But I'm here to tell you, it was already too late. I want to read you another quote from the CBS documentary. Listen to this one carefully. The average homosexual, if there be such, is promiscuous. He is not interested in, nor capable of a lasting relationship like that of a heterosexual marriage. His sex life, his love life, air quotes, consists of a chance encounter, a series of chance encounters at the clubs and bars he inhabits. Inhabits. You realize how actually dehumanizing that word is? Quick one-night stands are characteristic of the homosexual relationship. You see, the APA decision was helpful, and of course it was a big day for the gays, but the damage was already done. Disordered, sick, mentally ill, somewhat akin to type 2 diabetes. Somehow or another, we could make this different now, right? We could repent. We could see a shrink. You could lose weight. You could stop buying Malamars in bulk. In these days, gays were invisible. And when we were visible, we were only men. And the stories that were told about us amplified these damaging stereotypes. In nearly every state, homosexuality was a criminal act. And if you wanted to read about homosexuality in the news, the place you'd most find it was in stories about men arrested for having sex in public parks. And do you know how often, when those men's names were published in those papers, those men took their own lives? Way too often. You see, gays were just sick. And then they really were. 1980s. And for so many, it was just oh so fitting. Gay men were just getting what they deserved. Of course, this is what happened to sinners and perverts. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan said and did nothing. Legislators said and did nothing. Millions of dollars were raised independently to start organizations like GMHC and AMFAR. Elizabeth Taylor and other celebrities saw people dropping like flies around them and put their time and treasure to bring organizations like AMFAR to life. And it actually wasn't until Rock Hudson came out and died, which were almost at the same moment, did the lens on the topic shift at least a bit. And in some ways, this was the tipping point. The gay community rose up, marched in the streets for their dead brothers, for the rights they deserved. It's a pretty grim story. But from 1985 to 2003, something happened. A cultural sea change. We went from sick and diseased, disordered, sinners in the closet or hiding behind potted plants. And if you see the CBS documentary in its entirety, you will see men hiding behind potted plants for fear of being seen on national television. From 1985 to 2003, we went from images of suicidal, self-loathing serial killers in TV and film to 1998. Openly gay men starring in an NBC comedy. In 2003, an openly gay woman came into your living room every day, as she has since 2003, never failing to mention her relationship with Portia de Rossi. And then in 2002, the New York Times added gay and lesbian couples to its wedding changes. These are cultural sea changes. And if you want to change hearts and minds, you start here. You see, this journey has and continues to have real impact, because you can no longer be arrested for being gay, thanks to the Supreme Court. LGBT people now have the legal right to marry, thanks to the Supreme Court. This is a story about the power of media to change hearts and minds, what's known as media advocacy. So, the Pew organization does studies on attitudes and opinions quite frequently, and they've done several of them on attitudes and opinions towards LGBT people. And they ask this question: what is the single biggest influence in changing your attitude about LGBT people? It will not surprise you that the number one answer, it sort of feels like I'm playing Family Feud all by myself from my home office. Number one answer is knowing someone who is. The technical term for that is contact. You researchers, you come up with the coolest phrases. Now, what do you think the number two, what do you think comes in second place? What is the second most influential way in which people change their hearts and minds about LGBT people? The stories and images in the media. The number two way. This is what we call imagined contact. So think about Ellen in your living room, chatting about her wife. Imagined contact. This equation tells the story for me about what is possible, what is needed, how you can change the narrative and the story about diabetes. Acceptance comes from understanding, and understanding comes from visibility. But fair, accurate, inclusive visibility that tells the whole story. So in 1985, a group of lawyers got fed up with how the media was covering the AIDS epidemic. And they created this organization, GLAAD, the first civil rights organization that focused only on the media, the key to changing hearts and minds. There is not another civil rights movement that has an organization that focuses specifically on the media, news, television, and film. And I believe that this recipe of media advocacy works for any community and any issue. So in the next just few minutes, I'm going to give you a sense of what that recipe looked like for us, what that journey between 1985 and 2003 looked like. The first step in media advocacy is to monitor and to react. So we said to ourselves, well, are LGBT people visible in news and entertainment? Sorta. Were the stories and images fair? No. Were they defamatory and distorted? You bet they were. Did the stories tell the whole story? Did we only see drag queens on roller skates, or did we also see gay alums of Yale? Did these stories reinforce stigma and discrimination? Oh my God, they sure did. And so we started to think about how could we capture the information about the stories that were being told and then mobilize people to raise their voices. And so that's what we did. We started to build an army of people who would monitor the media, something that was harder to do in 1997 than it is to do in 2020, I might add. And I could tell a lot of stories, but I'll tell you two. The 75th anniversary issue of Time magazine hit the newsstands, and I hit the roof. 75th anniversary issue, never mentioned the word gay, never mentioned the word AIDS. We were absent. We mobilized thousands of people to write letters, to call Time magazine, to call them out on this flagrant omission, an omission that told a story all its own. They didn't like that, and not one little bit. They called for a meeting with us, and we told them what the impact of being absent from this issue was like. Here's another case study, the Washington Post. We did this with lots of editorial boards. We monitored the coverage of the Washington Post on LGBT issues. We kept track of the stories that were unfair, defamatory, where they used sources that were not legit. And we asked for a meeting. We sat with them and we said, here's why these are problematic. By and large, people don't want to do the wrong thing. And we educated them. But reacting is not enough. You've also got to get out in front. You don't want to spend your whole time saying, no, that's not the whole story about diabetes. You've got to be proactive and get out in front. And so here are just a couple of stories. So we wagged our fingers at Time magazine, and then came the 20th century issue. Guess who Time magazine called to say, would you meet with us and talk about how we can make that issue inclusive? Well, we had just a few thousand ideas. There was a story about Harvey Milk. We've got Billie Jean King in the sports section of that issue. And that issue was something that Time magazine was so proud about. And in fact, we had awards that we gave to organizations that did a great job in the media. And that year, Time magazine won one of those awards for this issue. And then we met with people and met with people and met with people. And we educated with them and we suggested things to them. So we met with Mark Burnett's people before the premiere of Survivor. And we said, how about a gay castaway? Now, little did we know that the first gay castaway would actually win Survivor, that he was actually a very unpleasant person, and that he ultimately went to jail for tax fraud. Be that as it may, we had a gay character on Survivor. All My Children is an interesting story because it's imagined contact. For millions of Americans, the families in All My Children come into their homes every single day for 30 or 50 minutes. And we were responsible for advocating that they have the first lesbian character on All My Children. I want to go back to the Washington Post because the only thing, we didn't just wag our fingers at the Washington Post. We also gave them suggestions of stories they could tell. And they didn't have to just be stories about gay people. It could be a story about retirement and maybe include a lesbian couple who's also grappling with how to deal with their finances in retirement. And on top of that, We had a training department that trained LGBT people to be great spokespeople in the media. So not only was the content good, but the messenger was strong too. That's the kind of proactive work that makes a difference, because you don't want to just wag your finger. You want to help them solve the problem. What were we aiming for? Fair, accurate, and inclusive coverage of the LGBT community in all forms of media. It's important for me to say that the work is not entirely about eliminating stereotypes. Stereotypes are grounded in some reality. It's about advocating for a broad palette of images and stories so that people understand the three-dimensional life you lead. Stereotypes are real, and they're hard to deny. Here are three of them. Many gay men really do love Madonna and will sing show tunes all day and night. A surprising number of lesbians enjoy riding motorcycles. And yes, Virginia, there are drag queens, and many of them march in parades during Pride Month. You can't deny stereotypes. They just need to be part of a palette. I mean, look at me. I'm a walking lesbian stereotype. Here on the left, you'll see me the last time I believe I was photographed in a dress, and as close to a wedding dress as I will ever get. This is my first Holy Communion in 1964. On the right, much more like it. The tomboy at the beach, looking cool. I don't think I've ever looked as cool as I look here. This was 1970. So remember, we're not trying to eliminate stereotypes. We're trying to create a three-dimensional picture, in our case, of who the LGBT community was, so that people would understand all that we brought, all of what we were. So the lessons here are: see the media as a point of maximum leverage for fair, accurate, and inclusive story about diabetes. There is money out there. Invest in the work of media advocacy, or create volunteer groups to do this kind of work. My friend Rashad Robinson, who runs Color of Change, which is an online civil rights organization for the African American community, just got boatloads of money from the Ford Foundation to begin to look at how African Americans are seen on television crime shows. Can you imagine how much work he has to do? And third, accept some stereotypes, but educate the media to tell broader stories and be sure to tell them why it matters. Speaking of why it matters, I'd like you to meet my wife. This is Eileen. We've been together since 1983, and she's been a type 2 diabetic since 1994. Here's what she thinks people think of her: that she brought it on herself, that hidden in our freezer are gallons of ice cream that she consumes because she simply can't help herself. Number 3, she's never met a Cinnabon she didn't love. 4, if she could just get out of that Barco lounger, which we do not have, and exercise, things would be different. If only she had some discipline, she wouldn't be a burden on our healthcare system. She thinks people think that she wouldn't know a fresh vegetable if it hit her in the head. Here's what we would like people to know about my wife and living with diabetes. Her blood sugar will spike and then drop like a stone for no reason. And either situation will debilitate her for hours. That the meds she takes actually make it difficult for her to lose weight. that someone will say, you should exercise more, but be careful because exercise can actually make you hypoglycemic and your blood sugar can drop like a stone and you can pass out. My wife wakes up most days with numb toes and she finds it scary. And an overnight hypoglycemic incident caused her to be disoriented. She fell down a flight of stairs in our home. It caused a brain bleed and she had a craniotomy. That's what we would like people to know. That's the lived experience of a diabetic. There are stories out there to tell, and they need to be told. Embrace this power of imagined contact. Think about how you might mobilize and educate journalists, producers, and filmmakers. And like I said, advocate for a palette of images and stories that offer society a three-dimensional picture of diabetes and those that are impacted by it. Because this is the path to changing hearts and minds. You can do this. I'm going to stop sharing and say I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my story. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. I'm going to let us stay there for just a moment. All right, I'm going to let that sink in because I think if you all are like me, this continues a really powerful sort of a chain reaction as we build one conversation onto the next. And I think somebody said there that it was overwhelming, which I think it is, right? Because it is hard for us to combat these stories. And I think to some degree, I think there's some resistance in realizing how much work we have to do, right? And yet I think once we get over that and go, oh, let me ask you out in the chat, who's willing to do some work? You actually go, oh, well, actually I am. Well, I am. Like there are so many of you. I know your names. I've seen you before. We know each other. We're willing to work. But at first blush, it sounds like, oh my goodness, that's impossible. But guess what? Not impossible. It actually has happened, right? So I find myself a little bit emotionally raw, Joan, after your talk. So I'm still recovering myself, but maybe it isn't right to recover too much, right? Because we actually want to stay in that place, right? We want to stay in this knowledge of what our power really is and what's possible if we're willing to work for it, if we're willing to change the course of the stories that surround us, to reframe, right? To use research, to speak to those folks who speak in research, right? To recruit our spokespeople, train them, and make a difference. So again, Joan, thank you so much.